to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam. Welcome to another episode of Transformation in Trials. Today we have a real treat for you. We have two guests from crowdfunded cures. One is Nick Fiorenza and Savva Kerdemelidis. And they'll both tell us more about their backgrounds later on in the show, but we're going to dive straight into the topic. Well, the topic for today's episode is alternative financing models for clinical trials, but also drugs in general. This is one of my absolute pet peeves, and I'm very happy to have Savva and Nick in the studio with us. So the first question I would like us to focus on is, what is the predominant model for funding clinical research and drug development at the moment?
I mean, there's basically two kinds of options. So on the one side, you've got direct grant funding, which tends to be for basic research and investigator-initiated trials. And then on the other side, and that's sort of funding in advance. On the other side, you've got R&D funding from private industry, and that's very much focused on applied research. And that's kind of one of the real areas of interest that we think is an area that we can target, because the problem is at the moment, you can only get funding for your research, and it's only really got a chance of getting basically helping patients and getting to regulatory approval where it can become a mainstream medicine if it can be patented and a monopoly price can be charged. And there's so it's two main types, sort of basic funding, grant funding for basic research, and then private funding for patented drugs.
And does that work well for our industry, or are there any shortcomings to this model?
So the main shortcomings, I think, for the grant funding is that it's usually not sufficient to fund large clinical trials. Usually you have very small smaller clinical trials up to sort of phase 2. But that's typically not something that's sufficient to incentivize basically allow, say, a government to reimburse the costs of those prescriptions, although you can prescribe off-label. And then also typically doctors, they might be uncomfortable prescribing things off-label. So you wouldn't get to regulatory approval with grant funding. There's basically, that. And then on the other side with patented drugs, obviously you need to be able to get a patent and enforce a monopoly over it. There's a lot of, as we'll talk about later on, there's a lot of therapies where that's not actually possible, which we call unmonopolizable therapies, essentially where you can't enforce a monopoly price. And then on top of that, the other issue is that sort of these drugs get charged out at billions of dollars a year, and they end up being very expensive. And also a lot of patients, for that reason, cannot access them. So there's a few examples of that.
I mean, the drug industry, they very much focus on optimizing for new drug development, right? Where they can get those patents. And, that leads to systemic downstream failures from the patient side. And from the funding side as well. You have all these different compounds out there that we could look at, but pharma wants to focus more on the new drugs.
And so the model we have in place, the purpose, as I understand it at least, is to further innovation. So completely novel drugs, completely novel research. But do we actually see that? Are we getting the novelty that we want and the trade-off of having the patent system in place?
I think the main problem is this disconnect between what's actually valuable and the kind of what is actually the thing that the real innovation, and what the patent system incentivizes. So at the moment, basically, the patent system will incentivize privately generation of clinical trial data regarding a new patented drug. However, from a patient's perspective, from society's perspective, and scientists, what's actually useful is the treatment protocol. So the information that this particular drug, this molecule, is safe and effective treatment for these patients having for this particular patient population with this particular treatment protocol. And that data is I mean, there are a lot of things that don't fit within the patent system where you can't essentially enforce a monopoly price. So we can talk about later, like the main one that we're interested in is repurposing off-patent drugs, where the drug is already available on the market. The active ingredient is freely available for people to take. Things like supplements, diets, lifestyle interventions, anything really where you can't enforce a monopoly, the patent industry or the patent system doesn't really work. So the pharmaceutical industry is not interested, and VCs aren't interested in funding that research, even though the clinical trial data to generate those treatment protocols would be expensive and generally too expensive to fund with direct public funding.
And what kind of potential are we missing out on there with these non-monopolizable drugs?
We think there's thousands and thousands of, basically 90% of the drugs that your doctor prescribes are off patent. So it's the vast majority of the drugs that are out there are all off patent. Most drugs have more than one use, but research has shown that basically once a drug is available as a generic drug, which tends to happen around 10 to 15 years after the launch of the drug, the patent runs out. And then after that, the chance of getting regulatory approval is almost zero. It's very, very rare that you would get a new indication put on a label for this unreformulated drug. So, you can reformulate the drug, which is called evergreening and things like that, but sometimes the reformulation is actually not as effective as the original formulation. So an example of that is ketamine, off-patent ketamine, racemic ketamine is being shown to be more effective than the left-sided enantiomer S-ketamine. Yeah. So there's other examples as well of repurposing. The next got
there's potential for a lot of these drugs that have been used in a completely different indication. For example, antipsychotics for cancer therapeutics, because a lot of these disease pathways, a lot of the molecular pathways can be influenced by drugs that target different upstream elements, for example, different receptors on the cell membrane that has an effect downstream. Ultimately, that would lead to some kind of augmentation or reduction in whatever disease pathway, depending on what you want to achieve, right, and with the model. So yeah, it's super interesting space, and there's so much potential, especially across systems biology approach of what these repurposed compounds can do. It's really exciting to see more and more development across this, and we hope to help get that translated into the clinical side.
And that's very interesting. And you also mentioned natural substances that may not be patentable. What is the potential there?
We're really into the idea of plant medicines. I think there's been a lot of also recently a lot of interest in things like psychedelics, cannabis, used in medicinal way. Obviously supplements as well as a lot of there's 50,000 supplements out there, but it's actually, when you look into it, there's not a lot of clinical evidence that any of these supplements are effective treatments for any disease. And I don't think it's because of the lack of their ability to be medically effective, and we can talk about that later on. There are examples of supplements that can be used in that way, but it's really just it's a problem with there's a market failure for producing the clinical trial data. There's no way of basically recovering the costs of your clinical trials to prove that these supplements or natural therapies are safe and effective, and that's the reason why we don't see a lot of clinical evidence.
Yeah, there's also so much money wasted on supplements and natural alternative therapies, when that money could actually be used to finance clinically meaningful trials of those supplements. upstream from that. But yeah, that's just the way our society has been set up at the moment. So we hope to change that. Yeah.
Yeah. And what are some of the emerging alternative financing models than this predominant patent-based model? What are you working on?
Yeah, so that's what we're interested in highlighting. There are different models. Traditionally, there's been a lot of academic talk around the use of prizes as an alternative to patent incentives. So prizes have a little bit of a kind of, I guess, they're not seen as, I think the name prize kind of implies that it's something that's like not like a bit frivolous, but actually it falls within a broader section of financially innovative contractual mechanisms, which are called pay for success contracts, or they're also called outcomes-based financing. Other terms for them have been called advanced market commitments, which were actually used recently for the COVID pandemic to incentivize the rapid production of the vaccines and also COVID therapeutics. Things like they're called Netflix subscription payment models, where basically an agreement to pay a subscription, a fixed amount every year for access to a medicine, rather than linking the reward to the amount of the drugs or a monopoly price drug sold. So it's and these sort of fall within a broader subset of ideas called value-based pricing and things like that, which are also starting to be used more in the healthcare industry to increase efficiency and delivery of healthcare services. But particularly, there's another area. There's another name for them, not to overwhelm you, but called social impact bonds. And essentially, the idea behind all these things is to incentivize private industry to fund public goods, and the idea is that would be done in a more efficient way than the government basically spending it all on direct grants, which are there's a lot of perverse incentives around grant funding, and particularly that as the grantee, you're not incentivized to actually deliver; you're just incentivized to keep getting a grant. So there's a lot of waste at the moment in delivery of public services, and it's hoped that these financially innovative mechanisms will help bring some of the rigor and also the power of the markets to help efficiently allocate capital.
And that's interesting because what you describe is both distributed, but also very much capitalistic at the same time.
It's actually, it's seen as more of a decentralized model and more meritocratic, because if you think about grants, which typically, as scientists would, has to kind of labor through their whole lives, sort of up to, up to in their 40s before they get their first grant. And it tends to be, the NIH or something like that, a big centralized body, whereas the markets are actually a lot more sort of meritocratic, and they're kind of, it's not so political. Basically, either your treatment works or it doesn't. And I think, and there's this kind of fast fail and Darwinian approach to the markets, which I think could benefit a lot. But traditionally, there's been no way. The markets aren't interested in this kind of research and say repurposing, generic drug repurposing, or areas where they're not traditionally profitable because they can't enforce a monopoly price. So there's a lot of scope to play around with these new economic incentives.
And I know that a lot of the technology that you're looking at to support this change is based on the blockchain. But can you tell us more about how is it that the blockchain is applicable to your new way of thinking here?
Yeah, well, there is a big area in crypto that's specifically wanting to incentivize building public goods and funding of public goods. It's called refi, regenerative finance. Some of the bigger players are platforms like Gitcoin and Giveth, and but there are other areas, Optimism, folks there, and Vitalik Buterin, one of the founders of, the founder of Ethereum, has talked about retroactive public goods funding, which is basically like a prize-like mechanism, or basically the idea that if you produce a public good, there's a mechanism then for rewarding you in the future for producing that good. So there's a lot of interest in crypto around solving these problems, which are essentially public good problems, because particularly say for something like a repurposed generic drug, if you figure out that, say, aspirin is extremely useful to treat cancer, there's no way you can sort of recover the costs of the clinical trials proving that works, because you can't exclude people from public good is considered something that's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So in other words, you can't exclude other people from taking aspirin, and it's non-rivalrous in the sense that information, if somebody benefits from knowing that aspirin can treat cancer, then you can't sort of then the whole world can benefit from that information. It's not like only one person can know that and only benefit from it. But yeah, so there's a big interest in DeSci. I mean, that's where I met Nick basically through this. It's called decentralized science, and a lot of we're involved with a few of the players there. Vita DAO, which is focused on longevity, Molecule, which is focused on using these things called IP NFTs, which we're really excited about as a kind of a new way of creating a new kind of financial model to incentivize investment in early stage clinical trials. And we're specifically trying to look at basically using this retroactive funding or impact markets, or what they call impact certificates, to provide the source of retroactive funding to fund these kinds of things.
Well, maybe it's time to get a little bit more specific. Maybe you could give us an example of how could this work in the future, or maybe some examples of how you have seen this work right now.
Success financing or outcomes-based financing, there's already around $700 million being raised for like these instruments called social impact bonds. They're mainly, basically what they do is they mainly say were used for delivery of public services. So for instance, there's social impact bond for, the first one was to reduce prisoner recidivism. And what happens is typically when people go to jail, they tend to go back to jail. And but if you can keep them out of jail for a year, then their chance of going back to jail significantly reduces. So the government would say under one of these social impact bonds, if you can keep a prisoner out of jail, like put them in work and get them let them land on their feet again, we'll give you £10,000 or something like that, or $10,000 on the basis that's going to save us $100,000. So that creates this scalable model for investing for private investment in programs to keep people out of prison. And the same thing with homelessness. So that's kind of rolled out. The issue is they're quite expensive and it takes a long time to negotiate these social impact bonds. You've got about 5 different stakeholders, and the estimate is around 30% kind of transaction costs by the time you do it. So if it's $10 million, you might spend $3 million on fees and things. But with crypto, potentially you can reduce a lot of those transaction costs and make it scale. And the area that we're particularly interested in is around using these pay-for-success models to repurpose generic drugs or patent drugs. Our view is like if you can repurpose one off-patent drug, like say a ketamine to treat depression. Ketamine was traditionally used as an anesthetic, but if we could use it to treat depression, that might, ketamine is like $4 or about $10 a course. At the moment, the patented version of ketamine, S-ketamine, is $12,000 a course. So it's extremely, and it's an extremely effective treatment for people who are suicidal and as they've had treatment-resistant depression. It's seen as like a bit of it's seen as like one of the first new kind of treatment modalities that have come out in the last 20 years. So, if we could, but unfortunately, it's only available off-label, which makes it quite expensive actually for people to access because they need to go to special clinics to get it administered. The clinics can't get insurance, so they have to they have to pay very expensive levels of insurance. And also the government and health insurers won't reimburse those costs because of the lack of private incentives to do the clinical trials. So, one of those drugs could save governments and health insurers like over $1 billion. But there's no way to capture those cost savings and incentivize private industry. And our interest is in creating like a pay for success contract, say $100 million, or we'll do an advance market commitment and we'll give you those funds if you successfully, say, repurpose ketamine. There's a bunch of other drugs and areas, particularly in the psychedelic space.
And is there any reason why the psychedelic space is specifically well suited for rethinking the patent situation?
Well, psychedelics, I think, is an area where there's a lot of pushback on use of patents. There's a lot of basically there's thousands of years of history of psychedelic medicine being used to sort of help people psychologically and to heal trauma and things like that. And what's happening with patents is that there's no private incentives to, and there's also evidence that, say, psilocybin mushrooms, we might have co-evolved with these molecules, and they might have helped guide our evolution and lead to things like language and religion and stuff like that. So there's a lot of reasons why we should be maybe using those off-patent molecules. But instead, what's happening is that, you've got pharmaceutical companies coming in and tweaking those molecules and then patenting those tweak molecules. And we're not really sure how safe and effective they are. There's also a lot of pushback from the psychedelics community around the idea of closing things off and sort of basically fencing things off and reducing access to these medicines, which traditionally have been available to everyone. So yeah, it's kind of like the tension between the open source community and the closed source community. And I think psychedelics is a really good example of where patents traditionally patents there's a lot of pushback on the idea of using patents to basically develop fund R&D in the space.
Yeah, you could also look at the ketamine versus S-ketamine, so racemic generic ketamine versus S-ketamine that's been patented by J&J with Spravato. It's been shown that intravenous, it's has to be injected. Ketamine, racemic ketamine is much more effective than what's currently patented, this S-ketamine, right? So not only is it cheaper, it's more effective in this case, and right. Who was able to incentivize the research and development of those clinical trials, doing a head-to-head study, for example. That's where we see a lot of potential, especially in the psychedelic space, and then also looking at, naturally occurring psilocin within the psilocybin mushrooms versus the patented version that a lot of companies are looking at, LSD as well, versus new synthetic versions of LSD, et cetera, et cetera. So there's tons of opportunity within the psychedelic space to develop unmonopolizable therapeutics using the pay for success model.
I'm curious, is there like a geographical distribution to where the community is more receptive to these kinds of ideas, or is it a certain layer of society, or where do you find kindred spirits?
From my perspective, and that's kind of the reason why I think I sort of my background is in patent and law, and actually I'm a patent attorney and commercial lawyer, but I did science and I kind of was frustrated, and one of the reasons why I got into this space is the frustration about the lack of empowerment of scientists under the current system. Particularly, they're sort of either forced to go into academia, where a lot of their research, they've got this publish or perish mentality. Otherwise they sort of go to the dark side and they make these, it's a pharma, and then they're forced to kind of make these drugs where they basically slowly realize that a lot of these medicines are not actually that effective, or they're less effective than an off-patent drug, which was sort of. So I think the scientific community and the DSci community has a lot of a lot of kind of people that understand these issues. Specifically around psychedelics, I think generally people are kind of more into the idea of making things open and sharing and the idea of community ownership and open source.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what stands in the way of some of these models to become more widespread in in the industry?
From my perspective, I think it's just sort of inertia, like particularly in the pharma industry, the VCs. If you talk to any kind of VCs, pharma VCs, they've just got like, they just see everything through the patent system, and also like there are so many, like the rewards are so great, but there's also it's a real lottery. But if you win the lottery, then you've got sort of $10 billion kind of thing, because that's kind of the average amount of sales that you might get for a new patented drug that's relatively, that might be slightly more effective than all the other drugs out there. You're basically given this huge incentive through the patent system. So as a result, they kind of see everything through the patent system. And then on the other hand, you've got payers like governments and health insurers that will gladly pay billions of dollars for those drugs. And they sort of, there's a lot of institutional inertia. So I think that's one of the main problems, is that particularly payers like governments and health insurers do not, they're less, they're just conservative, and they see this as quite a radical thing, the idea of financial innovation and agreeing to pay upfront for essentially what would be a very low cost drug. But you are basically paying for the data to repurpose that low cost drug in a new indication. So yeah, I think that's the main one. It's kind of institutional inertia and lack of awareness. Maybe for whatever reason, this is seen as quite a kind of radical idea, even though conceptually it's quite simple. I think though there are issues around pay for success, particularly where, typically it might take 3 or 4 years to repurpose a generic drug. So you've kind of got to agree on a price before you know what the outcomes might be, what the drug might be capable of. But there's ways around that problem. You can tie the price of the drug or the outcome payment to how well it does in clinical trials. And there's already existing pay for performance contract arrangements that payers get into that sort of do that. So it's more just, overcoming institutional inertia. Things like prizes and incentive prizes are quite new. Although, ironically, it's something Obama administration was looking into recently. It's something called the America Competes Act, where federal agencies are actually authorized to establish innovation prizes up to $50 million without Congress approval. And I think that's recently gone up to $100 million, but there haven't really been any done. So, I think it's just a matter of people are a bit slow to move, and maybe they don't see any use cases, but maybe with increasing healthcare costs and sort of things like that, the aging baby boomer population, we might see a bit of change.
Well, you're definitely wrestling with some of the core issues in the life sciences space. Can you tell us more about crowdfunded cures, but also how both of you arrived at working in this space?
Crowdfunded cures was sort of came out of the ideas in my master's thesis, which I published in 2014. I set it up as a New Zealand charity in 2013. The idea was to use these kind of prize-like or medical prizes, flexible prizes, to incentivize the development of what I called unmonopolizable therapies. So things like repurposing generic drugs, supplements, diets, lifestyle interventions. And at the time, there hadn't been a lot of literature on these things like social impact bonds and stuff like that. I hadn't really heard of them. And then I kind of went away, sort of career got in the way. And then more recently with COVID, I've there was a lot of controversy around hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and all that stuff, and the amount of money wasted on very small clinical studies and people still arguing about it became this big political thing. It really energized me to kind of try and address this problem. And then I heard about VitaDAO and the DeSci movement. I've also been involved with a few crypto projects and advising a few crypto projects, sort of from the ICO days. So that's how I came across the DeSci movement, and that's where I kind of met Nick, and that's where we're kind of trying to engage with people and build it up. And we've partnered with now VitaDAO and Molecule and SciDAO, which is looking at psychedelic medicine, LabDAO, which is like a decentralized CRO and lab services. It's we're looking to sort of build this up and launch some pilot programs, particularly interested in psychedelics and ketamine, doing an open source or open ketamine project with SciDAO.
I left the lab in 2014 after completing my master thesis, and I was really just fed up with the whole system around publishing or perishing, which is currently the way academia works. So I left the lab, I went into industry, started off as a research analyst for a boutique consulting firm in the life sciences, then moved into business development for some startups here in Berlin. And while while working in one startup, I then started doing a bit of volunteering for VitaDAO, and that's where I came across Savva. He kept posting all this really interesting stuff about repurposing generics, and that was my focus during my master research, is looking at an antipsychotic and using it against colon cancer metastasis. And I was like, well, what is this guy talking about? This is super interesting. There's so much potential in the drug repurposing space. So I reached out to him, and then we started working more closely together last year, and here we are. So it's been really fun journey so far. A lot of questions that open up once you get the answers to just more and more levels of complexity that we're trying to unravel. And ultimately, like, what we're doing around this space is around the whole, like, market failures due to those, coordination failures. It's a very challenging project to work on, but it can be very rewarding once you get the ball rolling and start getting more awareness and getting more people interested and moving that forward. Because why should all these drugs that have been developed not be used and shelved? All these patients, and there's, I don't know, over 6,000, 10,000. There's a lot of different diseases out there where there's only a small sliver of drugs that can be used for them, right? So patients are missing out. And if we have already so many drugs at our disposal, we should find ways to get them into a clinic and being used, right? If they are off patent, great, right? Because that can help to support a much lower healthcare cost for the patient, ultimately for governments. What can they do with that money that they save ultimately, or health insurance, etc. So it's quite challenging, but it's super interesting, and I really want to see this move forward.
Just to dive in at the end, I'm curious as to whether you've come up against any headwinds from the more traditional pharma industry in your pursuit.
I mean, from not a lot. I mean, there are people that basically think that repurposing is not very. There's not a lot of like hits and a lot of opportunities, but so it's not really worth it. Or that you maybe can, if there is a repurposing candidate, then you can reformulate it in a way that can, you can enforce a monopoly price, but as we were saying before, there are examples of chemicals where, like ketamine, where the original formulation is actually more effective than the reformulation. So patients are actually losing out and suffering from the lack of incentives here. And the patent system is kind of incentivizing people to, create drugs that are potentially more harmful for patients. But I mean, so there's that side. But in general, though, I think even pharma industry are actually looking at repurposing a lot more, but through this reformulation angle, because they're sort of reaching diminishing returns themselves. There's this idea of Eroom's law, which basically is the reverse of Moore's law. And it's saying that basically over time, it's becoming more and more expensive. Pharma productivity is getting lower and lower. And one of my views is that basically we're probably running out of small molecules, particularly small molecules, maybe not biologics, but and mRNA and things, but definitely, chemicals that we can take that won't kill us. And it's sort of like there's sort of like tools in the toolbox, and you've got, that's what doctors use, and they're sort of like, there's no private incentives to find new ways of using those tools to kind of press the buttons on the body to help repair it. From pharma, actually, we're probably probably not even big enough to really be important. But we've actually spoken to people in pharma, and they haven't been too negative about it.
Awesome. Sounds good. And where might our listeners be able to head to if they feel inspired by what they've heard here and they want to personally go and donate?
So definitely check out our website, crowdfundedcures.org. Just one word, crowdfunded cures. And we've got social media. It'd be really cool if you're into Discord and crypto, come onto the Discord. That's on the bottom. If you look at the bottom of our website, we've got links to all of our socials. We've got our YouTube channel as well with a nice explainer video and some presentations that I've done as well. Plenty of information out there. Just kind of encourage you to kind of read up. We've got a blog on the website as well. And if you're interested, we'll get involved. We need all the help we can get. It's a bit of a, to be honest, like the main issue is it's a bit of a political issue, but we're hoping that initially to kind of launch a pilot, we can sort of get, say, a high net worth person or a charity that has a particular disease area of interest, and whether that might be, using psychedelics to treat depression or whatever, and that will be willing to basically step in and act as if they act as the government in this stage and agree to back one of these pay for success contracts, say over $1 million or $10 million or whatever, to prove that this model actually works for incentivizing private investment in clinical trials.
Well, as we round off, we always ask our guests the same question on the show, and that is, if there was one thing you could change about the life sciences industry, what would that be? And I'll address that to both of you.
And from my side, I would like to see more direct ownership from the patient side over patentable therapeutics, and have a stronger say in the way things are done, like a bottom-up approach. I think you're starting to see that now with the rise of DAOs through blockchain and crypto economics, which is really cool. So you're going to see a lot more smaller, let's say, more patient groups that might have been overlooked previously coming together and potentially launching their own, let's say, token to get more research and research and development dollars into different therapeutic areas that are relevant to them. So like SciDAO, for example, VitaDAO longevity, SciDAO being psychedelics. There's even Cherub's DAO, which is focused on brain health. There's going to be so many different projects that come out about the decentralized science space with the focus on biomedical innovation. So I hope to see that continuation. It's still really early days. Some proof of concepts have been achieved, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more acceleration in this field. So we might be on an inflection point.
I second that. And from my perspective, though, it's mainly about payer reform. So pharmaceutical payers, the people who basically buy healthcare data and healthcare innovation. What I would like to see is that they move towards, rather than just paying for drugs, which incentivize pharmaceutical companies to basically just keep selling us these drugs that might not be curative, but just treat symptoms, that people actually paid for outcomes. And essentially, like if you do cure a patient, doesn't really matter what modality you use, whether that's a diet or an off-patent drug, or even combinations between drugs, or even a personalized medicine approach where everyone, gets an individual sort of cocktail of drugs depending on their specific DNA and profile and blood tests. By paying for outcomes, then we're incentivizing people to deliver those outcomes rather than just paying for, very expensive drugs and things like that. So I'd like to, move towards these pay for success models, where we are kind of basically leveraging all of the new breakthroughs of the 21st century. Things like personalized medicine and these cheap DNA tests and blood tests and all of these generic drugs that we have available, and nutraceuticals and information around diet and lifestyle interventions and all that stuff that we know, that doctors know is very effective, but there's just no private incentive to really optimize and fund those clinical trials to get better outcomes for patients.
That's definitely a future that I would like to live in. Thank you both so much, Nick and Savva, for coming on the show.
Great to be here. Really awesome time.
Yeah, thanks so much. As I was saying, it's great to talk to folks that are really into this space, and we hope that we're also happy to partner and speak to anyone. Really, we're kind of in full evangelist mode. So anyone that's got an interest in this space, particularly looking at financial innovation to help fund medical research, just feel free to reach out.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivana Rosendahl on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.